What happens when a starving alien child steals from the wrong human? What he found in that crashed ship didn't just save 3 lives, it changed the fate of an entire galaxy. But first he had to survive the creatures hunting them in the dark. This is that story. Kane had stopped counting the days. 1723 time blurred together when you're stranded on a planet that wants you dead. The storm-scorched wasteland stretched endlessly in every direction, nothing but rust-colored sand and jagged rocks under a sky that never seemed to settle on a single shade of orange. His escape pod had become home, a cramped metal coffin that reeked of recycled air and desperation. The crash had killed his navigation systems, his long-range comm hell, even his coffee maker. What remained was enough power for basic life support and the emergency beacon that had been broadcasting his location for weeks to absolutely no one. Kane crouched beside the flickering campfire he'd built from salvaged components, stirring a thin gruel that barely qualified as food. The ration packs were running low. Another week, maybe 2 if he stretched them. After that, well, he'd cross that bridge when the hunger made the decision for him. The silence was the worst part. Not the kind of peaceful quiet you get in a library or a chapel. This was the oppressive, unnatural silence of a world holding its breath. No birds, no insects, no wind, just the occasional groan of metal cooling in his wrecked bomb and the soft hiss of his failing air recycler. That's when he saw it, a shadow, quick, darting between the scattered debris about 50 yards from his camp. Kane's hand moved instinctively to the plasma pistol on his hip. Pirates, scavengers. On this godforsaken rock, anything was possible. He'd learned the hard way that rescue wasn't coming. His own crew had made that crystal clear when they jettisoned his pod during their hasty retreat from the Helix sector. The shadow moved again, smaller than he'd expected, hunched, desperate. Then he saw the face, a child. Couldn't be more than 12, maybe 13 years old, but not human. The skin was pale lilac, almost translucent, with delicate features that seemed carved from moonlight. Sunken cheeks told a story of starvation. Clothes were little more than rags wrapped around a skeletal frame. And those eyes, enormous, silver, filled with a kind of hunger that went deeper than food. The kid was creeping toward his supply cache, moving with the practiced stealth of someone who'd stolen before. Many times before. Kane didn't move, didn't breathe. Just watched as tiny fingers worked to pry open the sealed container where he kept his remaining ration bars. The child's hands shook, whether from weakness or fear, he couldn't tell. Smart kid. Knew enough to go for the food, not the equipment. Survival instinct. Kane respected that. The container seal gave way with a soft pop. The child's eyes went wide at the sight of the silver-wrapped nutrition bars inside. Real food, not the scraps and chemical paste that had probably been keeping this little one alive. But hunger made you careless. The kid grabbed 3 bars at once, too many to carry quietly. One slipped from those trembling fingers and hit the ground with a metallic clink that rang out like a gunshot in the dead silence. Both of them froze. Kane watched as the child's head snapped up, those silver eyes meeting his across the camp. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The kid looked like a cornered animal ready to bolt. Kane looked like a man trying to decide if he was angry or impressed. Then the child ran, but not before Kane saw something that made his chest tight. The kid wasn't running away from the camp. The kid was running deeper into the wasteland toward a cluster of twisted metal about a quarter-mile south. And clutched against that thin chest wasn't just the stolen ration bars. It was a water purification tablet. One of his last. The kid wasn't stealing for kicks. This was organized, purposeful. Someone else was out there. Someone who needed clean water. Kane should have stayed put, should have secured his remaining supplies and written off the loss as the cost of doing business on a hostile world. But 32 years of living had taught him to read between the lines, and everything about this screamed family. Desperation. Love making someone brave enough to steal from a stranger with a gun. He followed. The child moved fast despite obvious exhaustion, jumping from rock to rock with the sure-footed grace of someone who knew this terrain intimately. Kane kept his distance, using the scattered debris as cover. His military training kicked in automatically. Stay low. Control your breathing. Don't make noise, Beak. The twisted metal resolved into something more complex as he got closer. Not just debris, a ship, crashed, recent by the look of it. Parts of the hull still gleamed with that fresh wreck sheen that hadn't been dulled by weeks of sandblasting wind. But it was the heat signatures that made him pause. His handheld scanner picked up 2 bio readings inside the wreck. One small moving around. That was the kid. The other was larger stationary. And weak. Very weak. Kane crept closer, pressing himself against the buckled outer hull. Through a gap in the metal he could see inside. The child was kneeling beside a woman. She was clearly the same species as the kid, that same pale lilac skin and delicate bone structure. But where the child looked starved, she looked broken. Bruises covered her arms and face. A makeshift bandage wrapped around her left thigh was soaked through with blood that looked more black than red in the dim light. And she was beautiful. Even battered and unconscious, there was something about her that made Kane's breath catch. High cheekbones, full lips, hair like spun silver that caught what little light filtered through the wreck. The child was trying to give her water, tilting a cracked cup to her lips, while whispering something in a language Kane didn't recognize. The tone was universal, though, pleading, desperate, the kind of voice that said, "Please don't leave me alone." That's when the woman's eyes opened. They were the same silver as the child's, but older, wiser, and when they focused on Kane's face through the gap in the hull, they held a mixture of fear and fierce protectiveness that he recognized immediately. Mother, she tried to sit up, winced, fell back against the wall. But her hand moved to something beside her. A weapon, old-style energy rifle, probably military surplus. Her finger found the trigger guard even as her body shook with the effort. "Stay back," she said in accented English. Her voice was hoarse, probably from dehydration, but there was steel underneath the weakness. "I won't let you hurt him." The child moved protectively between them, clutching the stolen ration bars like a shield. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," Kane said, keeping his voice calm and steady. He raised his hands slowly, showing empty palms. "Your boy here borrowed a dish to buy some supplies from my camp." "I didn't borrow," the child said, lifting that small chin with defiant pride. "I took them. Mama needs food." Direct, honest, no shame about the theft because the theft had purpose. Kane found himself almost smiling despite the situation. "What's your name, kid?" The child glanced at the woman, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. "Luma," came the quiet reply. "Luma, that's a good name. Strong name." Kane shifted positions slightly, moving his hands to his supply pack. Both mother and child tensed. "Easy, easy, I'm just getting something." He pulled out a full water bottle and a medical kit, moving slowly and deliberately. No sudden movements, no threats. "I'm Kane," he said, setting both items on the ground between them. "And I think we need to talk." The woman stared at the water bottle like it might explode. Her grip on the rifle never wavered, but Kane could see the internal war playing out behind those silver eyes. Trust versus survival. Hope versus bitter experience. "Why?" she asked finally. The single word carried the weight of someone who'd learned that kindness usually came with a price. "Because you're hurt," Kane said simply. "Because your kid is starving, and because sitting in that wreck waiting to die isn't going to help either of you." Luma looked between them, reading the tension like a survival manual. Smart kid, probably had to grow up fast in whatever hell they'd escaped from. The woman's name, Kane learned, was Riven, and she had every reason to distrust strangers. They'd been running for 3 weeks. Refugees from a purge on the outer colonies where mixed settlements had become targets for something called the hegemony. Luma's father had been human. That made them both marked for elimination in the new order. "They came at night," Riven explained as Kane worked on cleaning her wounds. She'd finally accepted his help after Luma collapsed from exhaustion, trying to care for her alone. Burned everything. Everyone who couldn't prove pure bloodline was loaded onto transports. Her voice was steady, clinical, but her hands shook when she mentioned the transports. Whatever happened on those ships, it wasn't quick and it wasn't clean. "We hid in the cargo hold of a freighter," she continued. "Thought we were safe, but they found us 3 days out from the system." "The crash?" Kane asked, applying synthetic skin to a particularly nasty gash on her thigh. "They shot us down, left us to die on this rock." Her jaw tightened. Apparently, execution is too good for half-breeds. The casual cruelty of it hit Kane like a physical blow. He'd seen plenty of war, plenty of senseless violence, But there was something about hunting down families' children that made his blood run cold. "Well, Stim," he said, securing the bandage with perhaps more force than necessary, "they made a mistake leaving you alive." For the first time since he'd found them, Riven almost smiled. Almost. The temperature dropped fast once the sun disappeared behind the mountain range. What passed for night on this world was a strange twilight that never quite achieved true darkness. The sky faded from orange to deep purple, and somewhere in that transition, the world woke up. That's when they heard the first howl. It started low, almost subsonic, vibrating through the metal hull of the crashed ship. Then others joined in. A chorus of something hungry and patient and very much not human. Luma pressed closer to his mother, those wide silver eyes reflecting fear that was clearly learned from experience. "They hunt at night," Riven whispered, her hand finding the rifle again. "Pack hunters, scent trackers. We've been avoiding them for days, but the blood from my wounds..." She didn't need to finish, Kane understood. They'd been leaving a trail that anything with half a nose could follow. "How many?" he asked, checking his plasma pistol's charge level. "Last time we saw them, 6, maybe 7. But they're smart, coordinated. They'll send scouts first, test our defenses." As if summoned by her words, something scraped against the outer hull. Metal on metal, claws testing the strength of their shelter. Kane moved to the largest gap in the hull and peered out into the purple twilight. At first nothing, then a shadow detached itself from the rocks about 30 yards away. It moved wrong, too fluid for something with bones, too purposeful for something without intelligence. When it stepped into a patch of clearer light, Kane got his first good look at what had been hunting them. It stood roughly 7 feet tall on 4 powerful legs that ended in razor-sharp talons. The body was sleek, predatory, covered in what looked like natural armor plating. But it was the head that made his skin crawl. Almost humanoid, but wrong. Too many teeth. Eyes that tracked with the cold calculation of something that viewed everything else as meat. And it was looking directly at him. "Well," Kane muttered, "that's new." The creature let out a low rumbling call. Immediately answering calls echoed from at least 4 different directions. They were surrounded. "The ship won't hold them," Riven said quietly. She was trying to keep the fear out of her voice for Luma's sake, but Kane could hear it anyway. "The hull is too damaged, too many ways in." She was right. The crash had torn open multiple entry points. They could maybe defend 1 or 2, but not all of them. And once these things got inside, "Then we don't stay," Kane said, making a decision that would have seemed insane an hour ago. "We run." "To where?" Riven's voice cracked slightly. "In case you hadn't noticed, we're in the middle of nowhere. No cover for miles." "There's always cover," Kane replied, pulling up the tactical map on his scanner. "Question is whether you're willing to trust a stranger with your lives." The scraping sounds grew louder, more confident. Whatever was out there had finished its reconnaissance and was moving to the attack phase. "I've got emergency supplies cached about 2 miles northeast." Kane continued watching the scanner track multiple heat signatures closing in on their position. Military-grade shelter, weapons, food, if we can reach it. "If," Riven repeated. "Yeah," Kane admitted. "Big if." Another sound joined the scraping, a rhythmic tapping like fingernails on glass. One of the creatures had found the main viewport and was testing it methodically. Tap, tap, tap. The reinforced, transparent aluminum was cracked from the crash. Each tap spread the fracture lines a little further. "How fast can you move?" Kane asked Riven. "Fast enough," she lied. "Mama, this is, Luma whispered, "your leg." "We'll hold," Riven said firmly. She struggled to her feet, testing her weight on the injured limb. Pain flashed across her face, but she didn't fall. "What's the plan?" Kane was already moving, gathering his gear with practiced efficiency. "I've got 3 smoke grenades and 1 thermal charge. We blow the back wall, use the smoke for cover, and run like hell toward the ridgeline. Stay low, stay quiet, and whatever you do, don't look back." The tapping stopped. In the sudden silence, they could hear breathing that wasn't their own. Something had found another way in and was working its way through the ship's interior. "Now would be good," Riven said, her rifle trained on the corridor leading deeper into the wreck. Kane pulled the pin on the thermal charge and slapped it against the weakest section of the rear hull. 10 seconds, he announced. "Everyone down." The explosion wasn't loud, but it was hot. Very hot. The charge melted through the metal like it was butter, leaving a hole big enough for them to crawl through. Kane tossed the first smoke grenade through the opening, then the second. Dense gray clouds billowed out into the night air. "Go," he said. "Go, go, go." Yes. Luma went first, his small size making him the fastest through the opening. Riven followed, favoring her injured leg, but moving with determined grace. Kane came last, pausing only to arm and roll his final grenade back into the ship. They had maybe 30 seconds before the creatures figured out what had happened. The smoke provided cover, but it also made navigation nearly impossible. Kane's tactical training kicked in. Count steps, monitor direction. Trust your instruments, not your eyes. "Northeastern," he called quietly. "Follow my voice." Behind them, the delayed grenade detonated. Angry roars erupted from multiple throats. The hunt was officially on. They ran across open ground that seemed to stretch forever. Riven's breathing grew labored, but she kept pace. Luma moved like a ghost, silent and sure-footed. And behind them, the holes grew closer. That's when the ridge line finally came into view, and with it, Kane's cache. A reinforced emergency shelter built into the rock face, camouflaged and stocked for exactly this kind of situation. "Almost there," he panted. A roar erupted from directly behind them. Too close. Way too close. Kane spun around and saw one of the creatures bounding toward them, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Its claws dug furrows in the hard-packed earth with each stride. He drew his plasma pistol and fired. The bolt took the creature's center mass, sending it tumbling in a spray of ichor and smoke. But the others had heard the shot. They knew exactly where their prey had gone. "Inside," Kane barked, keying open the shelter's security lock. "Now, Trinette!" They dove through the opening just as another creature crested the ridge. Kane slammed the blast doors shut and activated the electronic locks. For the moment, they were safe. For the moment, outside, something heavy threw itself against the door. Then again, the reinforced metal held, but each impact sent vibrations through the entire structure. "Will it hold?" Luma asked in a small voice. Kane checked the structural readouts on his wall display. The shelter was rated for Category 5 storms and small arms fire. But whatever was outside wasn't using small arms. "For now," he said. "But we're not staying." Riven looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Where exactly do you propose we go? In case you missed it, there's a pack of very angry predators right outside that door." Kane was already moving to the back of the shelter, pulling away what looked like a solid rock wall to reveal another passage. "Emergency escape tunnel," he explained. "Comes out about half a mile north near a natural cave system. Military protocol, always have 2 ways out." "And then what?" Riven demanded. "We play hide and seek in caves until those things get bored, ma'am." "Then," Kane said, shouldering his pack and checking his weapon, "we find a way off this rock, together." The word hung in the air between them. Together, not just a temporary alliance, not just mutual convenience, a promise, a moment. The escape tunnel was a tight squeeze, carved through solid rock with military precision. Kane led the way, his headlamp cutting through absolute darkness, while behind him Riven and Luma moved, with the careful silence of people who'd learned that noise meant death. The cave system beyond was vast, ancient. Water had carved cathedral-sized chambers from the living stone over millions of years, creating a network of passages that stretched deep into the planet's crust. Their footsteps echoed strangely in the dark, bouncing off unseen walls and disappearing into depths that swallowed sound like a hungry mouth. "How far?" Riven whispered. Her injured leg was holding up better than expected, but Kane could hear the strain in her voice. "Another quarter-mile to the main chamber," he replied, consulting his scanner. "We can rest there, regroup, figure out our next move." What he didn't say was that his scanner was picking up something else in these caves, another heat signature, larger than the predators, and it was moving toward them with deliberate purpose. They emerged into a cavern so large that their lights couldn't reach the far walls. Phosphorescent mineral deposits in the rock cast everything in an eerie blue-green glow, like being underwater in an alien ocean. The air was warmer here, heated by geothermal vents that created strange updrafts and whispered conversations in languages no one could understand. That's when they found him. He was sitting on a flat rock near what looked like a natural shrine, completely motionless, waiting. Tall, even sitting down, maybe 7.5 feet when standing. His skin was a deep bronze color that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and when he looked up at their approach, his eyes were solid black. No iris, no pupil, just darkness that somehow conveyed more intelligence than any human gaze Kane had ever encountered. "You're being hunted," the stranger said in perfect unaccented English. His voice was deep resonant, like distant thunder. "The Keth pack has been tracking you for hours." Kane's hand moved to his weapon, but something in the stranger's posture stopped him from drawing. No aggression, no threat, just calm, patient observation. "You know about the predators?" Riven asked, stepping protectively in front of Luma. "I know about many things," the stranger replied, "including the fact that you have perhaps 20 minutes before they find the tunnel entrance. They're persistent and unfortunately quite intelligent." He stood then, revealing his full height and a build that suggested both strength and speed. He wore simple clothing that looked handmade but functional. No visible weapons, but something about the way he moved suggested he didn't need them. "My name is Vex," he said, "and I believe we may be able to help each other." "Let me guess," Kane said, his suspicious nature kicking in. "You just happened to be wandering around these caves when 3 refugees stumbled in. What a coincidence." Vex's expression didn't change, but something that might have been amusement flickered in those black eyes. "I've been tracking you since your escape pod crashed," Kane Fletcher, former Lieutenant, 3rd Colonial Marines, dishonorably discharged for refusing to execute prisoners during the Proxima incident. Kane's blood went cold. That information wasn't public record. Hell, most of it wasn't even in the classified files. "How do you—" "Because I was there," Vex said quietly. "Proxima Station. I was the one who gave the order you refused to follow." The cave fell silent except for the whisper of thermal vents and the distant drip of water on stone. Kane stared at this stranger who somehow knew his deepest shame, his greatest failure, his one moment of moral clarity in a war that had tried to strip away everything human about him. "Your hegemony," Riven breathed, her rifle coming up to target Vex's center mass. "One of them." "I was," Vex corrected, "past tense, just as you were once safe on a colony world and Kane was once a decorated soldier. We are all refugees from who we used to be." "Bullshit," Kane snapped. "You don't just walk away from the hegemony. They don't give retirement packages." "No," Vex agreed. "They give death sentences. Which is why I've been living in Kian, an abandoned outpost, for the past 2 years, staying one step ahead of the same hunters who found you." He moved closer and Kane noticed scars along his arms and neck. Recent scars. The kind you get from fighting for your life. "Proxima Station," Vex continued, "was my last mission as a loyal officer. Watch a human soldier execute unarmed civilians, then file a report confirming their inherent savagery. Proof that your species couldn't be trusted with mercy." "But I didn't," Kane said slowly. "No, you didn't. You looked at those prisoners, 2 elderly Centauri colonists and their granddaughter, and you said, 'No, sir, I won't do it.' Then you turned your weapon on me instead of them." The memory came flooding back. The sterile detention level, the smell of fear and ozone into you. A little girl with pale blue skin holding her grandfather's hand while hegemony officers watched through reinforced glass, waiting for the show to begin. "You could have killed me," Vex said. "Should have killed me. Instead, you set your weapon to stun and gave those people time to escape." "They died anyway," Kane said bitterly. "Your people hunted them down an hour later." "My people," Vex repeated. "Yes, they did, but you didn't know that would happen. In that moment, when it mattered, you chose compassion over orders. You chose to be human." Luma had been listening to this exchange with the wide-eyed attention of someone learning that the adults around him were more complicated than he'd imagined. Now he spoke up for the first time since entering the caves. "What happened to you?" he asked Vex. After Vex's attention shifted to the boy, and something in those black eyes softened. "I wrote my report, filed it with command, said the human subject had been evaluated and found suitable for integration into the hegemony's auxiliary forces. A lie, of course, but I thought, perhaps if I showed them that not all humans were savage, that some could choose mercy even in war." He trailed off, shaking his head. "They rejected the report," Riven guessed. "They court-martialed me for allowing a prisoner to escape, stripped me of rank, branded me as compromised by human contamination. Vex's voice carried the weight of someone who'd lost everything he'd ever believed in. Apparently, showing mercy was proof that I'd been infected by the same weaknesses they were trying to eliminate. "So you ran," Kane said. "So I ran. And I've been running ever since, just like you." A sound echoed from somewhere deep in the tunnel system, distant but unmistakable. The Keth pack had found their trail. "Touching reunion," Riven said, lowering her rifle but keeping it ready. "But those things are going to buy you run paying to be here soon. What's your plan?" Vex smiled, then the first genuine expression he'd shown since they'd met. The Keth hunt by scent and sound. They're pack predators, which means they coordinate their attacks. But they have one weakness, which is they're territorial. This cave system is home to something much larger and nastier than they are. Something that doesn't appreciate visitors in its domain. As if summoned by his words, a rumble echoed through the cavern. Deep, primal, the kind of sound that bypassed the brain and spoke directly to the lizard brain, fierce encounters that remembered when humans were prey. "What the hell was that?" Kane demanded. "That," Vex said, already moving toward another passage, "is our way out. But we need to time this perfectly. Too early and we become appetizers. Too late and we become the main course." More sounds echoed from the tunnel entrance. Closer now, the scrape of claws on stone, the wet breathing of something built for killing. "This is insane," Riven muttered, but she was already following Vex deeper into the cave system. "Insanity." Vex called back, is staying here and trying to fight a pack of Keth in their preferred environment. "Trust me, I know these caves, I know what lives in them, and I know how to make it work for us instead of against us." They moved through passages that grew progressively warmer and more humid. The phosphorescent glow grew brighter, casting their shadows in strange dancing patterns on the walls. And underneath it all, that rumbling grew louder. "Vex," Kane said as they navigated a particularly narrow section, "what exactly are we walking toward?" "Salvation," Vex replied. "I hope." Behind them, the first Keth howl echoed through the caves. They'd found the main chamber. The hunt was on. There, Vex pointed ahead to where the passage opened into another vast space. "The thermal chamber. We make our stand there." "Against what?" Riven demanded. "Everything fish," Vex said grimly. "But with luck, they'll be too busy fighting each other to worry about us." They emerged onto a natural ledge overlooking a chamber that defied description. It was huge, easily the size of a sports arena. The floor was broken by steaming pools of mineral-rich water that glowed with bioluminescent organisms. And scattered throughout the space like islands in a toxic sea were nests. Large nests. "Oh shit," Kane breathed. In the center of the chamber, coiled around the largest thermal vent, was something that made the Keth pack look like house pets. It was easily 40 feet long serpentine, but with multiple arms that ended in crystalline claws. Its hide was translucent, revealing organs that pulsed with their own inner light. And when it sensed their presence, it raised what might generously be called a head. No eyes, no mouth, just a collection of sensory organs that somehow conveyed a malevolent intelligence that was ancient when the Keth species was still learning to use tools. "Vorthan," Vex whispered, "cave dragon, apex predator, and very, very territorial." The creature's attention fixed on them with laser intensity. It moved with fluid grace that was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. "Run," Luma suggested in a very small voice. "Not yet," Vex said, pulling something from his pack. A small device that looked like it belonged in a laboratory, not a cave. "Wait for it." The first Keth burst into the chamber, saw the Vorthan, and skidded to a halt with an expression of pure terror. More followed until the entire pack was spread across the ledge system, caught between the humans above and the dragon below. The Vorthan's attention shifted to these new intruders. Its crystalline claws scraped against stone as it began to move. "Now," Vex said, activating his device. A high-pitched whine filled the chamber. The Vorthan's sensory organs flared with obvious pain. The Keth pack scattered in confusion, their coordination broken by the sonic disruption. "Sonic disruptor," Vex explained as they ran along the ledge toward another exit. "Scrambles the nervous systems of most predator species. Won't last long, but it should give us enough time to..." The device sparked and died. Below them, the Vorthan shook off the sonic interference and turned its attention back to the closest targets, which happened to be the Keth pack. What followed was less a fight than a demonstration of why there was only one apex predator in these caves. The dragon moved with impossible speed, its crystalline claws shearing through the Keth's natural armor like it was paper. The pack tried to coordinate, tried to use their numbers advantage, but they might as well have been attacking a force of nature. There, Vex pointed to a passage on the far side of the chamber. Emergency exit leads to the surface about a mile from here. They ran along ledges that were never meant for human feet, jumped gaps that would have been suicide attempts under normal circumstances, and somehow miraculously reached the exit passage just as the Vorthon finished dealing with the last of the Keth pack. The creature's attention turned back to them, but by then they were already disappearing into the darkness of the escape route. "That was your plan," Kane gasped as they climbed toward the surface. "Let the monsters fight each other." "Sometimes," Vex replied, "the best strategy is to be the least interesting target in the room." They emerged into the purple twilight of the alien night, gasping surface air that tasted like freedom. Behind them, the cave mouth glowed with the bioluminescent fury of something that did not appreciate being disturbed. "So," Riven said, collapsing onto a convenient rock and finally allowing herself to show the exhaustion she'd been hiding, "What now?" Vex consulted a handheld device that looked far more advanced than anything Kane had seen. "Now we find a way off this planet. Together, because separately we're all dead. But together," he looked at each of them in turn. "Together we might just be something new." "Something new?" Luma asked. "A family," Vex said simply, "the kind that chooses each other instead of sharing blood." And for the first time since the crash, Kane allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they might actually survive this. Hope, as it turned out, was a dangerous thing to carry on a hostile world. They'd been walking for 3 hours across terrain that seemed designed by committee to break human spirits. Jagged rocks that cut through boot soles, sand that got into everything and abraded exposed skin, and a wind that never stopped howling, carrying with it the promise of worse weather to come. Vex led them with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going. His scanner showed a hegemony outpost roughly 12 miles northeast, abandoned according to his intelligence, but with a functional long-range transmitter that could reach shipping lanes. "How do you know it's abandoned?" Riven asked, adjusting Luma's pack straps for the third time in an hour. The boy was keeping up, but barely. "Because I'm the one who helped evacuate it," Vex replied without breaking stride. 2 years ago, when my desertion became public knowledge, the hegemony pulled back from exposed positions. Couldn't risk their people being contaminated by my influence. "Your influence?" Kane asked. The idea that maybe humans weren't the monsters they'd been taught to believe. Vex paused to check his bearings. Dangerous thinking in a regime built on the premise of genetic superiority. The outpost appeared on the horizon like a mirage. Low functional buildings clustered around a central communication array that reached toward the alien sky like a steel prayer. Everything was the same gunmetal gray that marked hegemony construction throughout the galaxy. Efficient, soulless, built to intimidate rather than inspire. "Looks dead," Kane observed, studying the complex through his binoculars. "Looks can be deceiving," Vex warned, but he sounded uncertain for the first time since they'd met him. They approached carefully, using the scattered equipment and supply dumps as cover. The main gate stood open, which was either a very good sign or a very bad one. No guards, no lights, no signs of recent activity. But something felt wrong. Kane couldn't put his finger on it at first. Then he realized what was bothering him. The place was too clean. Abandoned facilities accumulated debris dust, the random detritus of neglect. This outpost looked like it had been maintained. "Vex," he said quietly, "when exactly did you say this place was evacuated?" 26 months ago, Vex replied, but there was doubt creeping into his voice. "My intelligence indicated." That's when the lights came on. Floodlights erupted around the perimeter, turning night into harsh artificial day. Klaxons began wailing. And from concealed positions around the complex, armed figures emerged with weapons trained on their little group. Hegemony soldiers. At least a dozen of them, in full combat armor with the kind of energy weapons that could vaporize human tissue at the molecular level. "Contact Alpha," one of them spoke into his comm unit. "We have them." Vex stood very still, his hands visible and empty, but Kane could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his weight shifted to the balls of his feet. A man preparing to fight or die. Vex Coranthi, a new voice called from the direction of the main building. The prodigal son returns. The speaker, who emerged from the shadows, was clearly hegemony brass, tall, elegant, with the kind of bearing that spoke of generations of genetic modification aimed at creating the perfect soldier administrator. His uniform was immaculate, his posture suggesting that he'd never experienced a moment's doubt about his own superiority. "Commander Thane," Vex said quietly, "I should have known." "Should have known what? That we've been tracking you for 2 years, that we knew about your pathetic little crusade to prove human worth." Thane's smile was cold enough to freeze helium. "Or that we've been using you as bait to draw out other defectors and sympathizers." The words hit like physical blows. Kane felt something cold settle in his stomach as the implications became clear. "You've been following us," Riven said. It wasn't a question. "Following, tracking, documenting. Vex here has led us to 3 other hegemony defectors, 2 underground networks, and now," Thane's gaze swept over Kane, Riven, and Luma with clinical interest. "A human soldier with a conscience and a pair of half-breed refugees. Quite the collection." "You bastard," Vex snarled, his composure finally cracking. "I trusted you. I served with you for 8 years. And your service was exemplary," Thane agreed. "Right up until you decided that human sentiment or choice was more important than genetic purity. Tell me, Vex, was it worth it? All this running, all this hiding just to prove that animals can show mercy?" Kane's hand inched toward his sidearm, but a dozen weapons tracked the movement. Not yet. He needed a better opening. "They're not animals," Vex said quietly. "I've seen what humans can do when pushed to their limits. I've seen them choose sacrifice over survival, mercy over vengeance. They're capable of things we've forgotten how to be." "Touching," Thane replied, "but irrelevant. The Hegemony Council has decided that the human contamination has spread far enough. Tomorrow we begin the final cleansing. Every human settlement, every mixed colony, every place where your kind has managed to take root." The casual way he said it made Kane's blood freeze. Genocide delivered with the same tone most people used to discuss the weather. "You can't," Luma said, speaking for the first time since the soldiers had appeared. His young voice carried a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "There are billions of people on those worlds. Families, children." Thane looked at the boy with something that might have been amusement. "Children who will grow up to spread the disease of human sentiment further. Better to end it now cleanly than allow the infection to metastasize." "The infection," Riven repeated, her voice deadly quiet. "You mean compassion, love, the willingness to help strangers." "I mean weakness," Thane corrected. "The inability to make hard choices for the greater good. The foolish belief that all life has value regardless of genetic fitness." That's when Kane understood something fundamental about the enemy they were facing. This wasn't just about territory or resources or political power. This was about 2 completely different ways of seeing the universe. The hegemony saw strength and purity in the elimination of anything that didn't fit their perfect design. Humans saw strength and diversity in the messy, complicated business of caring about people who weren't like them. And those 2 worldviews could never coexist. "You know what your problem is, Thane," Kane said, his voice carrying the calm confidence of someone who had finally found his line in the sand. "You've never understood what actually makes humans dangerous." "Enlighten me," Thane replied with mock interest. "You think our strength comes from being individually superior, faster, stronger, smarter than everyone else. But that's not it at all." Kane glanced at Riven, at Luma, at Vex. "Our strength comes from the fact that we don't face the universe alone." "Philosophy," Thane dismissed. "How quaint. Guards prepare them for transport. The council will want to study them before the final cleansing begins." That's when everything went sideways. Vex moved first, diving toward the nearest guard and using his superior reach to grab the soldier's weapon. Energy bolts sizzled through the air where he'd been standing. Kane drew his plasma pistol and put 3 shots center mass into the closest threat. Riven, moving with the fluid grace of someone who'd been a soldier long before she'd become a mother, swept Luma behind a supply container and brought her rifle to bear. The firefight was brief, violent, and utterly chaotic. Hegemony soldiers were trained, disciplined, and well-equipped, but they'd made the mistake of underestimating their prisoners. More importantly, they'd made the mistake of letting Vex get close enough to cause havoc. When the shooting stopped, 8 hegemony soldiers were down. Thane was wounded but alive, propped against a wall with Kane's plasma pistol pointed at his head. And Vex was bleeding from a graze across his ribs that looked painful but not fatal. The transport, Vex gasped, pointing toward a sleek hegemony corvette parked near the main building. "We can use it to reach the shipping lanes." "Can you fly it?" Riven asked. "I designed half the systems on that class of ship," Vex replied. "The question is whether we can reach it before reinforcements arrive." As if summoned by his words, the comm system crackled to life. "Outpost 7, this is Fleet Command. Report status. We're showing weapons discharge at your location." Thane smiled through his pain. "You have perhaps 20 minutes before a full battle group arrives. Even if you reach your ship, you'll never make it out of the system." "Maybe," Kane agreed, "but we're going to try anyway. Because that's what humans do. We try even when the odds are impossible." "Especially when the odds are impossible," Riven added, helping Luma to his feet. Vex was already moving toward the Corvette, his scanner showing clear approaches to the landing pad. "This way. Stay low, stay quiet, and remember, once we're aboard, there's no going back." "Good," Luma said with the fierce determination of someone far too young to understand hopelessness. "I like going forward better anyway." They ran across open ground under an alien sky, 4 unlikely allies bound together by necessity and something deeper. Behind them, Thane's mocking laughter echoed across the outpost. Ahead of them, a stolen ship represented their only chance at freedom. And somewhere in the darkness between those 2 points, Kane realized that this wasn't just about escape anymore. This was about proving that Thane was wrong, that humans weren't a disease to be cleansed from the galaxy. They were something far more dangerous than that. They were hope with weapons and the absolute refusal to go quietly into extinction. The Corvette's engines were already warming up by the time they reached the ship. Vex had been right about knowing the systems. Within minutes, they were strapped in and lifting off into the hostile night. "Where to?" Vex called from the pilot's seat. Kane looked out the viewport at the stars beyond the atmosphere. Somewhere out there were billions of people who had no idea that their time was running out. People who deserved a chance to fight back. "Everywhere," he said quietly. "We warn everyone we can reach. We tell them what's coming, and we give them a choice." "What choice?" Riven asked. "To stand up and fight," Kane replied, "or to die on their knees." The ship broke atmosphere, leaving the hostile world behind, but they carried with them something more valuable than their lives. They carried the truth, and sometimes the truth was enough to change everything. 3 weeks later, Kane stood on the bridge of what had once been a hegemony listening post and was now the nerve center of the most unlikely resistance movement in galactic history. The transformation had been remarkable. What started as 4 refugees fleeing a dying world had become something the hegemony hadn't planned, for proof that their greatest fear was justified. Humans really were contagious. Not with disease, but with something far more dangerous. The idea that you could choose your own family. That you could fight for people you'd never met. That mercy and strength weren't opposites, but 2 sides of the same coin. The listening post hummed with activity. Former hegemony soldiers who'd chosen conscience over orders. Human refugees who'd refused to die quietly. Even a few other species who'd grown tired of the hegemony's version of galactic peace. They worked side by side, united by something more powerful than genetics or politics. They were united by hope. "Report," Kane said to Vex, who was coordinating intelligence from a dozen different sources. 17 colonies have received our warning broadcasts," Vex replied, his fingers dancing across multiple displays. 9 have begun evacuation procedures. 4 are organizing defensive positions. The others, he paused. "The others don't believe us." "Can't blame them," Riven said from her position at the tactical display. She'd become their de facto military strategist, her experience with asymmetric warfare proving invaluable. If someone had told me 3 weeks ago that the entire hegemony military was planning to commit genocide, I'd have thought they were paranoid. "The evidence is mounting," Luma added quietly. The boy had grown up fast in the past weeks, his natural intelligence making him surprisingly useful as a data analyst. Hegemony fleet movements are consistent with preparation for simultaneous strikes on 47 human settlements, 47 worlds, billions of people. Families who went to sleep each night believing they were safe under the umbrella of galactic civilization. Kane felt the weight of that knowledge like a physical thing pressing down on his shoulders. They'd done everything they could with the resources available. Broadcast warnings, shared tactical data, even helped coordinate some evacuations. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Incoming transmission, Vex announced. Priority channel, it's Commander Thane. The main screen flickered to life, revealing the pristine interior of a hegemony command ship. Thane stood in the center of the frame, his uniform immaculate, his expression carrying the satisfied confidence of someone holding all the cards. Kane Fletcher, Thane said, his voice carrying clearly across the bridge. I have to admit, you've been more resourceful than anticipated when evacuated colonies. Several thousand humans who might otherwise have died in the initial strikes. Quite impressive for a disgraced soldier and his collection of misfits. Just getting started, Kane replied evenly. I'm afraid not, Thane corrected. You see, your little resistance movement has served its purpose. You've forced the remaining human populations to reveal themselves, to choose sides, to expose their sympathizers among other species. Very helpful, actually. Makes our targeting much more efficient. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. They'd been trying to save people, and Thane had turned their efforts into a trap. But more importantly, Thane continued, you've demonstrated exactly why the human contamination must be eliminated completely. Your influence has spread to 17 former hegemony officers, 43 enlisted personnel, and representatives from 6 different species. The infection is worse than we calculated. It's not an infection, Luma said, his young voice carrying clearly across the comm. It's just people realizing they have a choice. Thane's attention shifted to the boy, and something cold flickered in his eyes. The hybrid child. Still alive, I see. How sentimental of you to keep it around. His name is Luma, Riven said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that suggested someone was about to have a very bad day. And if you threaten him again, I will personally make it my mission to hunt you down and show you exactly what human savagery looks like. Threats? Thane seemed genuinely amused. From your position, I have 12 battle cruisers surrounding your little outpost. You have a converted listening station and a handful of ships you have stolen from us. We have something you don't understand, Kane said quietly. Something you've never understood, which is we have something worth dying for. Thane's expression shifted slightly. Not quite uncertainty, but perhaps the first hint that this conversation wasn't going exactly as he'd planned. Tomorrow at dawn local time, the final cleansing begins, he announced. 47 human settlements will be sterilized simultaneously. The contamination will be burned out of the galaxy once and for all, and you, Fletcher, will watch it happen from the front row. I don't think so, Kane replied. You don't have a choice. My ships have you surrounded. Your position is hopeless. Surrender now and I'll make sure your deaths are quick. That's when Vex smiled, actually smiled. You know, Thane, that's the thing about humans that you've never grasped. They have this annoying habit of refusing to accept hopeless situations. What are you talking about? Tell him, Luma, Vex said gently. The boy stepped forward, his young face serious but unafraid. 3 weeks ago, when you were so busy tracking us, you missed something important. The listening post wasn't really abandoned. It was just sleeping. Thane's confidence was starting to crack. The automated systems, Luma explained with the patient tone of someone explaining something to a child. They've been recording hegemony fleet movements, communications, tactical data for the past 2 years. Everything, including the locations and firing solutions for every ship in your task force. Understanding dawned on Thane's face. That's impossible. The post was deactivated. The post was camouflaged, Vex corrected. By me. 2 years ago, when I realized what the hegemony was becoming, I made sure that someone would be watching, recording, preparing. Even if that's true, Thane said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. You still don't have the firepower to... He was interrupted by proximity alarms screaming across his bridge. His head snapped towards something off-screen, and when he looked back at the camera, his face had gone pale. "What did you do?" he demanded. "We made friends," Riven said simply. The tactical display on the listening post bridge showed the truth. Thane's 12 battlecruisers were no longer alone. Emerging from hyperspace around them were ships from a dozen different species. Former hegemony vessels crewed by defectors, human freighters that had been hastily armed, even some civilian transports loaded with refugees who'd decided that running wasn't enough anymore. They were vastly outnumbered, outgunned, outclassed by ships that were newer, faster, and more heavily armed. But they were there. They had come when called. They had chosen to stand up. "You see, Thane," Kane said quietly, "that's what you never understood about humans. We're not stronger because we're pure. We're stronger because we're willing to fight for people who aren't like us. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, they decide to fight for you too." "This is suicide," Thane snarled. "Even with all those ships, you can't win. I have the entire hegemony fleet at my disposal." "Maybe," Kane agreed. "But here's the thing about impossible odds. They only matter if you're planning to survive." What happened next would be remembered as the Battle of Kepler Station, though the listening post had never officially been given that designation. It lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes. It involved over 300 ships and approximately 40,000 combatants. And it changed everything. The fighting was brutal, desperate, and completely one-sided in terms of ship-to-ship capability. Hegemony vessels were faster, stronger, and crewed by professional soldiers. The Resistance fleet was a collection of misfits flying everything from military corvettes to converted cargo haulers. But the Resistance had something the Hegemony didn't. They had Vex's intelligence on hegemony tactics. They had Riven's insights into asymmetric warfare. They had Luma's analysis of fleet weak points and targeting priorities. Most importantly, they had 4,000 people who'd chosen to be there, who'd looked at impossible odds and decided that some things were worth dying for. The tide turned when the hegemony's flagship Thane's command ship took a direct hit to its primary reactor. Not from one of the Resistance's heavier vessels, but from a converted human freighter that had rammed the cruiser's shield generators and detonated its cargo hold full of mining explosives. 17 people died in that explosion. 17 people who could have run, could have hidden, could have lived quiet lives, hoping the war would pass them by. Instead, they chose to make sure that Thane would never threaten another child like Luma. The battle ended with the destruction or capture of 8 hegemony vessels and the retreat of the remaining 4. More importantly, it ended with a Vesh broadcast of Commander Thane's confession recorded during his interrogation before his ship exploded. The final cleansing, the systematic genocide of every human settlement, the plan to eliminate the contamination of human influence from the galaxy, all of it transmitted across every communication network the Resistance could access. Within hours, the galaxy knew the truth. Within days, hegemony control began to collapse as member species realized what they'd been supporting. Within weeks, the war that the hegemony thought would solve their human problem had become a revolution that swept across known space. But all of that was still in the future. Right now, Kane stood on the bridge of a listening post that had become a symbol, surrounded by people who'd chosen to become family, watching the stars through a viewport that no longer showed the approach of enemy ships. "So," Riven said, settling into the chair beside him. "What now? Then?" Kane considered the question seriously. "Now we rebuild. We find the survivors from the colonies that didn't get our warning in time. We help the refugees find new homes. We teach people that the galaxy doesn't have to be ruled by fear." "That's a big job," Luma observed. "Good thing we're not doing it alone," Kane replied. Outside the viewport, ships from a dozen different worlds were already beginning the long journey home. Some carried refugees to safety. Others carried supplies to colonies that had been cut off by the fighting. All of them carried the knowledge that when the universe tried to tell them they had no choice, they'd chosen to prove it wrong. Kane Vex said quietly, "There's something I need to tell you about Proxima Station, about those prisoners you saved." "I told you," Kane replied. "They died anyway? Your people hunted them down." "No," Vex said softly. "They didn't." Kane turned to stare at him. "What?" "The 2 elderly Centauri and their granddaughter. They escaped in the confusion and when you set off the alarm, made it to a refugee transport. I've been tracking them for 2 years, making sure they stayed safe. They're alive." "Very much so. In fact, Vex gestured toward the communication console. They've been asking to speak with the human soldier who saved their lives. The screen flickered, showing 3 familiar faces. Older now, marked by hardship and loss, but undeniably alive. The little girl from his nightmares was now a young woman, her pale blue eyes bright with intelligence and hope. "Lieutenant Fletcher," the elderly male said formally, "we owe you a debt that can never be repaid." "You don't owe me anything," Kane said, his voice thick with emotions he thought were buried. "I just did what anyone would do." "No," the young woman said gently. "You did what humans do. You chose compassion over orders, love over fear, hope over despair." She paused, smiling with the radiant joy of someone who'd lived to see justice done. "And because you made that choice, we're here to make the same one. To stand with you, to fight for a galaxy where no one has to die for the crime of being different." Later, after the communications had ended and the immediate crisis had passed, Kane found himself on the observation deck. The stars looked different now. Not cold and distant, but warm with possibility. "Couldn't sleep either," Riven's voice came from behind him. "Too much to think about," he admitted. She joined him at the viewport, Luma appearing a moment later, as if summoned by some family instinct Kane was still learning to recognize. "Do you think we really changed anything?" Luma asked. "Or will someone like Thane just take his place?" "Probably," Kane said honestly. "There will always be people who think strength comes from purity. That difference is something to be eliminated rather than celebrated." "Then why fight?" the boy persisted. Kane thought about that for a long moment. Because the alternative is letting them win. Because somewhere out there is another scared kid stealing food to feed his mother. Another soldier being ordered to do something his conscience won't let him do. Another family just trying to survive in a universe that seems designed to tear them apart. "And," Riven prompted, "and they deserve to know that they're not alone. That someone will stand with them and not them, that the universe is big enough for all of us if we're brave enough to make room." He looked at the 2 people beside him. A woman who had lost everything but refused to lose hope. A boy who'd grown up too fast but hadn't lost his belief in tomorrow. His family, not by blood but by choice. By the decision to care about each other even when it would have been easier not to. "Besides," he added with a smile, "someone has to show the galaxy what humans are really good at." "Which is," Luma asked, "refusing to give up, choosing love over fear, and making families out of strangers." Outside the viewport, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small dramas of the beings that traveled between them. But on one converted listening post, in one small corner of an impossibly vast universe, 4 people who'd found each other in the darkness were proving that sometimes love really was enough to change everything. And sometimes that was all it took to save the galaxy. 6 months after the Battle of Kepler Station, Kane stood in a place he'd never imagined he'd see again. A garden. Not the sterile hydroponics bays of a military vessel or the cramped growing chambers of a space station. A real garden with actual soil under his feet and an honest-to-goodness sun warming his face. The colony of New Haven had been built from scratch by refugees from 17 different worlds, all of them united by the simple desire to prove that different species could not only coexist but thrive together. "The tomatoes are coming in beautifully this season," Riven said, joining him on the path between the raised beds. She carried a basket filled with vegetables that would have been considered impossible luxuries just a year ago. "Luma thinks we'll have enough to start trading with the agricultural settlements in the next system." Kane smiled at that. The boy had thrown himself into learning everything he could about sustainable farming, trade economics, and interspecies cooperation. At 14, he was already being consulted by colony planners from across the sector. Some people were born to be warriors. Others were born to build worlds. "Speaking of Luma," Kane said. "Where is he? I thought he was helping with the harvest today." "Planning committee meeting," Riven explained with barely contained amusement. "Apparently the representatives from Centauri 7 want his input on their irrigation systems." "Of course they do," Kane shook his head in wonder. "Remember when our biggest worry was whether we'd have enough water to last the week?" "I remember a lot of things," Riven said softly. "Most of them involve you making impossible choices seem easy." They walked together through gardens that were tended by humans, Centauri, former hegemony citizens, and half a dozen other species that had found their way to New Haven. Children played between the rows of crops, their laughter creating a soundtrack that spoke of futures that had once seemed impossible. "Any word from Vex?" Riven asked. Last transmission put him 3 systems away, helping establish another refugee settlement. Kane checked his comm unit. "He'll be back for the anniversary celebration next month. Wouldn't miss it." The anniversary? 1 year since a starving child had tried to steal from a stranded soldier, setting in motion a chain of events that had toppled an empire and rewritten the rules of galactic civilization. They decided to mark it not with speeches or monuments, but with something simpler. A festival celebrating the families people chose for themselves. "Do you miss it?" Riven asked as they reached the hilltop overlooking the main settlement. "The adventure, the constant danger, the feeling that you were changing the galaxy?" Kane considered the question seriously. Below them, New Haven sprawled in organized chaos. Prefab buildings mixed with structures designed by alien architects. Humans worked alongside beings they'd never seen a year ago. Children who'd lost everything had found new siblings in the most unlikely places. "No," he said finally. "I don't miss the danger. I don't miss wondering if we'd live to see another day. But the changing the galaxy part," he gestured toward the settlement, "that's still happening, just differently." "How so?" "Every time a human child learns to speak Centauri, every time a former hegemony soldier teaches someone how to repair a water recycler, every time someone who lost their birth family finds a new one." He paused. "That's revolution too. Quieter than battles and explosions, but just as powerful." Riven nodded, understanding what he meant. The hegemony had been defeated not just by superior tactics or lucky breaks, but by the simple, stubborn refusal of ordinary people to accept that they had to be alone in the universe. "The council voted today," she said after a moment, "about the proposal to expand the settlement. And by unanimous approval, we're officially accepting applications from the Kepler refugees, the survivors from the Outer Rim colonies, and..." She paused dramatically. 300 former hegemony military personnel who've applied for asylum. Kane raised an eyebrow. 300, that's more than applied to all the other settlements combined. Apparently word has gotten out that New Haven is the place where people get second chances, where what you did matters less than what you choose to do next. "Is that what we are?" Kane asked. "A place for second chances?" "Among other things." Riven's expression grew thoughtful. "We're also proof that the galaxy doesn't have to be ruled by fear, that different doesn't mean dangerous, that family is something you build, not something you're born into." And they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over a world that had been barren rock just 6 months ago. Now it hummed with life, with hope, with the kind of stubborn optimism that had once been dismissed as human naivety. "Mama Kane, sir." Luma's voice carried clearly across the hillside. They turned to see him running toward them, his face bright with excitement. "You have to see this." He thrust a data pad into Kane's hands. The screen showed a communication from the Galactic Council, the loose confederation of species that had emerged from the hegemony's collapse. "They want us to establish a formal embassy," Luma explained breathlessly. New Haven would become an official diplomatic posting representing refugee rights and interspecies cooperation. "That's..." Kane searched for words. "That's huge." "It means they're taking us seriously," Riven said, "not just as a successful colony, but as a new way of organizing galactic society." "Read the last part," Luma urged. Kane scrolled down to the signature block and felt his breath catch. The message was signed by 3 people: the Centauri representative he'd saved at Proxima Station, a former hegemony admiral who'd defected during the revolution, and a human diplomat who'd spent the past year helping coordinate refugee resettlement. "They're nominating you as the first ambassador," Luma said, practically bouncing with excitement. "All 3 species unanimous decision. They want the human who started the revolution to help shape what comes next." Ambassador. Kane had been a lot of things in his life. Soldier, refugee, resistance fighter. But diplomat, that was new territory. "What do you think?" Riven asked quietly. "I think," Kane said slowly, "that 6 months ago I was a man who'd lost his crew, his mission, and his faith in the future. Today I'm standing in a garden on a world that didn't exist a year ago. surrounded by a family I chose, and who chose me back, being asked to help build a better galaxy. Is that a yes? Luma pressed. That's a we'll decide together, Kane corrected gently. Because whatever we do next, we do as a family. Even if it means moving to a diplomatic station, fancy receptions, and political meetings. Even then, Kane looked at the two people who'd become his anchor in a chaotic universe, though I reserve the right to complain about having to wear formal uniforms. Riven laughed, the sound carrying pure joy. Deal, but you have to promise that no matter how important we become, we'll never forget how this started. How did it start? Luma asked, though he'd heard the story dozens of times. With a hungry child, Kane said, who was brave enough to steal from a stranger to feed his mother. And a stranger, Riven added, who was kind enough to follow instead of punish. And a soldier, Luma continued, who chose conscience over orders. And a mother, Kane finished, who taught all of us that family isn't about blood, it's about choice. They walked back toward the settlement as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new opportunities to prove that the galaxy was big enough for everyone. But tonight they were simply a family going home. Behind them, the gardens of New Haven continued their quiet work of turning empty soil into life. And in the distance, ships from a dozen different worlds approached the colony, carrying refugees who'd heard that somewhere in the galaxy there was a place where being different wasn't a crime, a place where strangers became family, a place where the impossible happened every single day. As they reached their modest home near the colony's center, Kane paused to look back at the hillside where they'd stood watching the sunset. In a few years, that would probably be covered with houses, schools, maybe even a small spaceport. The quiet garden they'd walk through would become a park where children from a dozen species played together. Change was coming, just as it always did. But for the first time in his life, Kane wasn't afraid of what that change might bring. Because whatever the future held, he wouldn't face it alone. None of them would. And sometimes in a galaxy full of impossible things, that was the most impossible thing of all. If this story moved you, if it made you believe in the power of chosen family and second chances, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. What would you do if you found yourself stranded on a hostile world with strangers who might become something more? Share your thoughts and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about humanity's greatest adventures among the stars. Because in a universe full of unknowns, one thing remains constant. We're stronger together than we ever could be apart. Until next time, keep looking up. The stars are waiting.